Good evening, everybody. I'm Andre Asselman, and I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure tonight to welcome you all to this very special event. Tonight we have three people involved in music. The first is Anthony Tommasini, whom most of you know already. He's the chief classical music critic for the New York Times. You can disagree with him, but then you're most often wrong. Tommasini is the author of Virgil Thomson, Composer on the Isle, and of Opera, A Critic's Guide to the 100 Most Important Works and the Best Recordings. Don't disagree with him. Scott Burnham is a professor at Princeton and here at the Graduate Center. He's a specialist in the history of tonal music and is also the author of Mozart's Grace and of Beethoven Hero, and has also written on Schubert, Haydn, and Schumann, basically all composers that I like. I don't know what happened to Bach, but anyway. And it is also a great, great pleasure to have tonight David Greilsammer. I first discovered him because a friend of mine who lives in Paris basically gave me his CD. It was a compilation of some of the early Mozart piano concerti, and what we all know the later piano concerti, but the really, really early ones, I had never heard them before because you kind of ignore them. That was my mistake. And what I particularly liked about David Greilsammer's piano playing was that he himself had composed the Cadenzas. So it was a very special recording, and ever since then I've been following his career. He has, since 2013, been the music and artistic director of the Geneva Camerata. It's an innovative orchestra, and it has traveled basically from Paris to Berlin to London, Venice, Istanbul, etc. Tonight he's going to be playing Scarlatti and Cage, but he will explain that to you in a moment. On Wednesday, and I have to do some advertising here, David Greilsammer will join Leonard Botstein, who is the president of Bard College, and Roger Cohen from the New York Times, and several other individuals to speak about the Holocaust, or at least about the inheritance of the Shoah among people who are alive today. After the recital, we will have a conversation with Tommasini, Burnham, and Greilsammer. Please welcome David Greilsammer.
I'm really looking forward to tonight, of course, in this residence. I'll try. Is it better? Yes. Okay. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to this week of residency. We have some great activities coming up, and I'm especially happy to be here surrounded by some great people tonight, and also happy to be performing the program you're going to hear. This is a program that's been following me in the last few years. It was also recorded on an album a couple of years ago, and the reason I wanted to play tonight, because for me this program in particular symbolizes a lot of things that are very important to me personally, and especially this idea of an encounter or a meeting point between two worlds that initially were probably never supposed to meet. So tonight you'll hear sonatas by Domenico Scarlatti, who was an Italian composer of the 18th century who lived in Spain, and you'll hear some sonatas by Cage, American composer, of course, and both wrote these sonatas more or less 2 centuries apart. And of course, Scarlatti could have never known Cage, and Cage, from what we know, didn't care very much in general for Baroque music, and probably didn't know that much, or wasn't interested so much in Scarlatti's music. So it would look on the paper as if there's nothing much to say about some proximity between these 2 composers. Now also sonatas are not something so special in classical music, as you know. Pretty much all the composers until the 20th century wrote sonatas. It's basically a very traditional form. Without getting into it, the sonata is the sonata as we know it, especially the sonata of the later part of the 18th century and especially 19th century, is something quite big, usually quite long. The sonata has a few movements. It has material that needs to be developed. So it's something, the sonata is always something, is a form that was requiring composers for a lot of, I would say, a lot of depth and some weight that went into the writing. And the interesting thing is that with Scarlatti, when we talk about sonatas, it's absolutely the opposite of what I just described. So the sonatas by Scarlatti are very short. They don't develop much of the material. Sometimes you have one theme that just disappears a few seconds later. Sometimes it comes back. Sometimes you have 7 themes. It's absolutely not symmetrical. He was apparently not very much interested in this whole idea of something long and that requires development. Just some ideas, a lot of colors, a lot of movement, a lot of ideas that go by. And it's a very modern way of writing, especially at the beginning of the 18th century. And then time goes by, 18th century, 19th century, these composers write these big sonatas, and comes John Cage and writes sonatas. And again, somehow, suddenly these sonatas become, once again, these very short pieces without really any particular form. And like Scarlatti, he's a composer who's interested in his sonatas in very short ideas, very precise kind of shapes, I would say. These are always, all these sonatas by Scarlatti and then 200 years later Cage are always very, I would say, radical in the sense of it's not just beautiful music. It's very clear that these composers are interested in something much more than just writing beautiful music, but reshaping the way the keyboard and the keyboard players have to go about the instruments. Now, the other interesting thing is that, of course, Scarlatti didn't write his sonatas for the modern piano. He wrote them probably for harpsichord or some sort of a harpsichord. And John Cage didn't write his sonatas for the piano. He wrote them for the prepared piano. So on this piano right here, there is a preparation required, which takes a few hours. And John Cage left a very precise kind of a map, I would call it, of how one needs to prepare this piano with nuts and bolts and all sorts of pieces of plastic and rubber. And it's not at all, a lot of us know John Cage as a composer who wrote chance music and something that has to do with all sorts of very vague and crazy ideas. But actually this is a very rigorous, very precise set of book of sonatas with the same preparation for all these sonatas of this book called Sonatas and Interludes for Prepared Piano. And it's always interesting to think that all the pieces of these little bolts and nuts that are in the piano he thought about the production of sound and where to put these nuts and bolts and pieces of rubber very precisely. Nothing here is chance. Now, of course, the sizes of pianos can vary. This is a relatively small piano, so you would have to sometimes readjust a little bit the placement. But overall, it will always more or less sound the same. Of course, you have a question of interpretation, but this is not the crazy, wild John Cage as some of us, I think sometimes by mistake, know him. It's much more intellectual, and it's really somebody who was looking to create new kinds of sound. And again, I go back to Scarlatti. He was clearly, at least for me, somebody who was looking to invent new kinds of sound with whatever instrument he had at the time. Nobody in the Baroque period wrote for a keyboard instrument like Scarlatti wrote. It's a very particular way of writing, very innovative, that requires the hands to do all sorts of things that other composers like Bach and Handel never thought of. Very unique way. And this is why some composers in the 19th century, like Liszt, we know that Schumann and Clara Schumann rediscovered also some sonatas by Scarlatti, and they were absolutely crazy about this innovation. So again, John Cage and Scarlatti, it's this dialogue that interests me, and this is why I initially wished to create this program. And you'll hear 16 sonatas, or 15. There's one that's that has a very unique shape in the Scarlatti sonatas. But basically, you'll hear them alternated one and one. So I'll be turning around between one piano and the other, and hopefully, it also, this proximity between the two pianos and the two composers can give a more, I would say, a deeper sense of exactly how this dialogue between these two worlds can happen either in reality or in our imagination. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to comment on that. Peeling away these pieces of score like artichoke leaves made me think that these sonatas from both composers are kind of like artichokes. They offer a kind of exotic sort of satisfaction that's hard to classify. And they certainly are exotic, both of them, right? I mean, Cage sounds like a kind of gamelan orchestra, which for us in the 21st century would be an exotic sound. And Scarlatti sounds a little bit like we've traveled to Moorish Spain or something. I mean, there's a guitar-like tactile thing, and you're the perfect player for these tactile adventures.
Thank you.
Anyway, I wanted you to go first, actually.
Well,
I'm sorry, I just jumped on.
If you want to talk about the music for a little bit, so the Cage was like 48 or so?
Somewhere in the 40s.
Yeah. When you think about it, other than for the invention of the preparing of the piano, which obviously was a very experimental thing, but I don't think he thought of it as radical as much as just an experiment. When you compare the music of that period to what else was being written, and compare the Scarlatti to what else was being written, Scarlatti's more radical.
Absolutely, and I think that's exactly something that people tend to forget, actually, that first part of the 20th century, I mean, Schoenberg, Berg, and all these innovators, or Debussy and Ravel, they had done all of this 30 years before, 20 years before, while Scarlatti was doing something totally different.
And I know some reviewers who will not be named have criticized him a little for the roughness with which he plays the Scarlatti. But, to me, the way at times, played beautiful delicacy also, but the kind of stuff. But I think you were trying to imitate the harpsichord, which can sound like an instrument of tin and gnashing string. And listen to Wanda Landowska playing the chromatic fantasy and fugue or something. Sounds like Liszt.
Yeah, and I think, again, this is a conception that I think can be quite wrong, because people tend to think about a harpsichord as this baroque, very elegant, and of course it can be too, but it has a complete, I think, this craziness about it, this instrument, and great harpsichord players have incredible liberty when they play, and I think we tend to forget that.
Right. We can, we were talking back in the room backstage about the concept of doing these kind of juxtaposed programs, which I love, when they're musicians like Pierre-Laurent Aymar does that, Peter Serkin has done things like that. But when we've talked before, you said you've gotten some wonderful, excited reactions from people, and you've gotten some criticism too, even people saying it's gimmicky and stuff. And what do you think about that?
I think, first of all, it's a very personal thing, especially for pianists. This whole idea of programming, for many pianists, they feel they have to defend the core repertoire in a very particular, traditional way, without mixing and blending, and I absolutely respect that. I think it's something that they might feel very strongly about. I just wonder about, for myself and in general, when preparing programs, until when we can go on by just playing the same kinds of programs, because again, it's very personal, but I think there is a point where history moves on. Right. The world is changing. If an iPad of today is totally different from one of 2 years ago, why wouldn't music change and evolve? And it's something
Concerts too.
Concerts, and something can work for 10 years and then be totally abandoned. And again, we talked about this before, this idea that we have to move with our time. We cannot stay stuck. And I remember back in when I was a student, every time I was looking at the board where all the music students, especially pianists, were publishing their upcoming recitals, and seeing like 3, 4, 5 recital programs that looked exactly the same, sometimes the same order, because many piano teachers and violin teachers had this urge, this need to keep something alive. And when you ask them, when you confront them, why does a program need to look like this? Why do you need intermission? Why do you need to play without your music? All these things about tradition that when you actually just stop for a second and ask yourself, actually, why are we putting the pianos in this way and not another? And many times there is a good answer. Many times there's absolutely no viable answer. It's just because somebody had done it 100 years ago and we just kept on doing the same thing. And that's where I think programming becomes interesting, where an interpreter feels very strongly about bringing something new and feels the urge to do it. And I'm totally okay with some critics feeling that this kind of program is, gimmicky or something like that. I always say, when I have the chance to speak about these kind of programs, and I've been doing a lot of these kind of juxtapositions in recent years, that it's about bringing forward new ideas. There's no truth. I don't believe that there is a truth in classical music or in the arts in general. It's just bringing, our job as artists is to bring ideas, sometimes be controversial, sometimes break some ideas. If we don't do that, who is going to do that? So I think and sometimes I go back to recital program a few years later and I think I was wrong to do it in a certain way. But at that point, I felt it was urgent to present this new idea.
Well, also, to me, when artists like you do this, I don't feel like you're overselling it or making a big statement. You're just saying, hey, listen to this. Hey, these two composers, it just occurred to me that I'm not, like you said before, that Cage had no interest in the Baroque particularly, but who cares what Cage thinks? This is what you think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's very often people maybe would tend to analyze something. Again, it's exactly what you were saying. I'm just trying at some points to stop and say, maybe we could illuminate this dialogue. Maybe we could just make a proposal and maybe it will develop into something else. Maybe it will just stop there. But
Scott, you may know more about, Liszt invented the recital. He invented the term too, and he chose that word because it was like a dramatic recitation. Almost, isn't that true? Yeah.
Right. It is interesting, and we were also talking backstage about this, and I imagine we'll talk more about it, about the historical shift from concertizing that focused on very recent things to concertizing like we have today, which tends to focus on things that are hundreds of years old. One thing I just wanted to jump on quickly about even if you were fanatically, obsessively obsessed with older music, the way that that these pieces profile each other, you could say that those Cage sonatas never had it so good as they do when they're interspersed with Scarlatti, and perhaps vice versa. There's something about, I know that you like to stress the dialogue, and I also think that when you put these two kinds of very different composers into dialogue, that each interlocutor is suddenly illuminated in a brand new way.
And especially in some Scarlatti sonatas that are extremely modern, some harmonies. There's this A minor one where really he writes these clusters that, even Bartók could have, or Schoenberg could have absolutely written exactly the same chords, and nobody would have said, oh, it sounds strange for Bartók. And again, Bach, Handel, all these composers exactly the same time Vivaldi would have never written this kind of music. And today we tend to, again, have this conception of Baroque as this very pure, and actually to me Baroque is one of the most radical periods. The other problem I find is that we tend to play a very specific time of the Baroque. We play, music of Scarlatti, Bach, and Handel, which is actually very late Baroque. It's almost classical, but when you go 100 years before, 50 or to 100, when you look at the first English or French Baroque, like Lully, or all these English like Byrd and Gibbons, these people who wrote Baroque, they did absolutely wild experiments that in the classical period, later on, like Mozart and Beethoven, if they had known about this, they would have gone absolutely mad. And that a little bit, I find, is worrisome, because as history goes along, we tend to become more and more conservative about what we think was the past. And this is something composers, contemporary composers, avant-garde composers write about this. When did we become so obsessed with the far past? Of course, we need to know the past, but back, 200 years ago, I don't think that people were obsessed with playing music from 100 years before that. It's just today we are obsessed with that.
In defense a little of the need to play this music, musicians do have this obligation to some extent, and orchestras, to keep this music alive. It's just that the balance is completely off in comparison with dance or theater. If you think of a repertory theater company has like a season of 12 plays. If 4 of them were new or very recent, and 4 were like mid-20th century, and 4 were like 19th century and earlier, that would seem extremely balanced, audience-friendly. Can you imagine if the New York Philharmonic played 1/3 new and recent pieces, 1/3 things from 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 1/3 like Ravel and earlier? It would seem radical.
They would get totally, the house would burn totally.
And so all people like me, I'm not saying the New York Philharmonic should become a new music ensemble. It's just that the balance has to be readjusted. And you were saying this about your programming in terms of when we talked about it, about the field can seem so disconnected, from what's. And
this is a feeling I have a lot. It's growing, and it's really becoming more and more apparent to me, is that I think all of us, especially when we travel, we go to museums, we go to galleries, and a lot of what, not all, but a lot of what we see, for instance, is, we go and visit 20th century department, like we'll go and see some Magrittes or Picasso's, of course, and today it will just be normal, but it's a total disconnect with music, because very few, I would say very few programs have a majority of 20th century, or it feels somehow, especially in a place like New York City, you have the Met Opera that, again, presents once a year, twice a year, a new production of something new, but the rest is Verdi and Puccini and Mozart, which is, by the way, I don't want to appear as somebody who hates that.
We all love it.
Yeah, we all love it, but again, it's totally reversed in that sense.
Yeah, in an earlier era, your radicalism would consist in the fact that you're dredging up these pieces from 200 years ago and counterpoising them with what's happening now.
As long as we're on this topic, I'll repeat this story that I was. The early music movement is profoundly important and taught us all sorts of valuable things. And but some of the people in that movement can be too dogmatic. And one of my favorite stories is the impresario Solomon knew Mozart in Vienna and said, "Hey, I want to hire you to put on a performance of The Messiah," which was not so well known at that time in Vienna. And Mozart said, "Oh, sure, I can use the money. I love the piece. It's great. Of course, we have to update it. I have to reorchestrate it, and we have to do it in German, and I'm going to cut things, and I'm going to add some clarinets. I'm going to add." He didn't think, how would Handel have done it? You know, like he wanted to make it up to date. It's the same impulse Mahler had in fixing the orchestrations of the Beethoven symphonies and stuff. He didn't think he was violating them. He thought he was helping them.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same thing as when one would go to a music school and go to a piano class and play a Chopin nocturne, and a teacher would, I'm not naming anybody, as you've noticed, would say, oh, but this slur above these notes, you know, it has to be played in a very certain way, and you could stay for 1 hour about talking about how, and this note, it has, and then today we know, for instance, that Chopin actually, to make money, he has like 6 or 7 versions of nocturnes just because he republished them, one in London, one in Paris, and every one of them has the slur in a different place. But then the teacher would just battle for, and then you get some perspective, and you think music is much more free than what we tend to think.
We do tend to lock these historical composers into a certain notion of organic unity and inevitability. Change one note and the whole thing would collapse in a heap. But I'm reminded of something that happened in Beethoven's lifetime, that he wanted to sell his Hammerklavier sonata, which is perhaps the most forbidding of all his piano sonatas. You were going to play that as an encore tonight, but we didn't have time.
After drinks.
Yes, right. And he apparently was trying to sell it to maybe a London publisher, I can't recall precisely, but he said, hey, you can cut the finale off if you want. You can switch these movements around, which if someone else were to actually talk about doing that with Beethoven, with any piece of Beethoven's, much less a mountain peak like the Hammerklavier, it would be a rare kind of blasphemy. So I think we do, and the concerts, you read about these concerts from the 18th century, and people would cry out to have a movement repeated right off the bat like that. They would be potpourri kind of things. There'd be a lot more kind of informal and lively than we tend to. We tend to make it a kind of going to church experience.
Well, you wanted to ask David about Mozart. I mean, this is the thing for all the rep he's getting tonight about doing these crazy juxtapositions. This is somebody who's played all of the Mozart piano concertos in the series, who played all of the Mozart piano sonatas in a marathon. So it's not like you're neglecting old music.
You know, I say this, it's quite, now it makes me laugh, even though I could be depressed about it, but many times when there's I'm discussing with an orchestra, for instance, about a possible invitation in the future, and I'll be discussing with a Baroque orchestra, and at some point in the discussion, many times they'll say, wait, aren't you this contemporary music guy? And then 2 days later, and this happened a few times, I'll be speaking to a contemporary music ensemble, and they'll say, wait, aren't you this Baroque guy?
Right, yeah.
And then, and it's, I say this because it's, I do many of these programs, but my entire background is extremely traditional and classical, and all my references are from Mozart and Beethoven and Bach, and this is where I take a majority of the ideas, and I would never do something like that if I hadn't studied all these years and done all my research about, you know, harmony and counterpoint and all these things. It's I always try to explain about certain people in the music business who have a hard time accepting these kind of programs, that all of the ideas that I care about really come from having gone through the studies of Mozart and all these great geniuses, and I would never be doing something like that today had I not played the 27 Mozart piano concertos or the piano sonatas. This is really where all these ideas come from. So
to me, as a critic, listening to performers, I feel I can tell the performers who are really involved with new music and contemporary music bring that sensibility to old music when they play it. You can't pretend that 250 years of music haven't happened since Scarlatti wrote those. It's in our ear. It would be weird not to hear some little thing the way you do, and oh yeah, listen to that. It's like bar talk. You can't wipe that away. I like that. But it's hard because a performer, you also don't want to distort a Scarlatti style or Mozart style. You want to be true to it, but yet you want to tweak it. And it's a hard balance, I think.
I think also part of it is because we have to accept that performing classical music in the 21st century is full of contradictions.
Right.
It's just the way it is. Of course, if you want to be a purist, playing Scarlatti on a modern Steinway is
already.
Yeah. So I think once we accept that not everything is 100% the way it should be, I don't know, something kind of biblical. Once we accept this, we can try and, again, propose something else, knowing what the past has taught us, but trying to move to the future.
Hey, even the biblical scriptures get interpreted much more
yes.
wildly than a lot of earlier music.
Esa-Pekka Salonen told me once, the conductor and composer, in an interview, that he said the hardest thing he does is perform like the Pathétique Symphony or the Eroica Symphony, because it's very hard to perform those pieces in a way that makes them sound like the wild, crazy pieces they are. You don't want to distort it, you want to be, and he said context is everything. What do you program it with? If you can juxtapose it against other things, new things and stuff, to give it a context so that you hear it differently. He said about the early music movement, which I don't mean to be criticizing tonight, he said that, take the Eroica Symphony, if you went to the hall it was premiered in, if you used all of the instruments, exact replicas, even the exact instruments of that time, he said you could even go around the audience and put lice in everybody's hair to replicate all the conditions that would have been, he said, and he said there immediately, for example, one problem is that the Eroica, when you heard the Eroica Symphony when it was premiered, other than for being on a battlefield where a bomb exploded, or if you were the guy who had the job in the bell tower of the cathedral pulling the bell, the Eroica Symphony would have been the loudest thing you'd ever heard in your life. Now that's gone. We will never have that association with the Eroica Symphony. What do? Amplify it? No, of course. It's just you got to let go of that. We're never going to hear it that way. Yeah, and that really stuck with me.
Yeah, and again, it's really context, and I think that's why not every program, but if a part of the programs can have a context and can have some mixing up old and new, it gives you a better understanding of how radical these composers were. And I would also say that if we talk about contemporary music, because this is always a difficult topic, and for many members of any given audience, contemporary music can be something a bit difficult or complex. I don't always think that this, just like Beethoven back in the 19th century, I'm not sure that as audience members we need to enjoy instantly everything we hear. Many times we'll go, how come we can go to a museum or gallery and see a painting and first be struck and think it's weird and then stay there, just stay or come back the next day or come back a year later and then but in classical music there's this judgment that if you hear a Boulez or Stockhausen piece and you think it's so ugly, and maybe that's even what the composer had intended, to shock you, but this was not the end, it was just a passage. But somehow with music, we don't have this kind of flexibility. I say we, but I think it's more difficult, even for us as artists. Sometimes we're so judgmental. We'll hear a young composer who just wrote his first orchestral piece, and we'll think, well, you can see that he hasn't matured yet. But again, Beethoven Eroica, or Mozart Jupiter Symphony, the last movement with this crazy fugue. People, I cannot even imagine what people hearing Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, the last movement, could even think about. Is it beautiful? Is it ugly? Is it crazy? Is it weird? But I think that's why in classical music, another element as audience members, as artists too, but especially audience members, is maybe to take sometimes also a step back when we hear something that's very difficult and truly imagine what we would do in a different context, like in a gallery, or like maybe in a very strange moment when we go to the theater and there's, I don't know, something happening on the scene. In classical music, we tend to have much less patience, and maybe it's also because of the world we live in, and everything is faster, everything is more complicated, we're more tired. I don't know, but I would urge all of us also to sometimes take a step back.
I think it has something to do with the nature of music and how it seems to work so closely with our identity. We can close our eyes if we don't like the Picasso Cubist painting. We don't have ways to close our ears. Sound is invasive in a way that visual may not be. I think that may be one of the reasons why it takes people longer to accept sounds. If you compare dissonant atonal music, the fate of that in the general public with the fate of non-representational art.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, there's a huge difference.
That's where I mean, besides the fact that I love my field, but it's of the performing arts, it's the most conservative. It just is, in comparison with the others. So there's that. People are used to hearing a lot of old stuff. The other thing, and I've written about this, and it's more important in the digital age than ever, is pieces of music take time. In the museum, you can spend 10 seconds or 10 minutes in front of a painting, and you pace yourself. That you can come back to it and look at it again if you want. Even a 20-minute sonata, which is not that long, you're asking people to pay attention, and its identity, its structure, everything about it evolves over time. You're not going to get it if you don't hear the whole thing. You have to give yourself over to it, let alone an hour-long symphony or something, really long. So I wrote a piece last year where I tried to say in the age of cell phones that this should be sold as an attribute of classical music. Turn off, drop out, for just a couple of hours. Just let yourself be given over to music,
It would have worked in the 70s. Tune out, tune in, and drop out, tune in.
I think also historically you can very clearly see that music was always late.
Right. It was late.
It was always late compared to literature and to art and to theater. If you look at, let's say, Romanticism,
right.
Good. In literature and in painting, for sure, it was already starting, in the 18th century. I would say last part of the 18th century, you definitely already had Romanticism all over the place. But Haydn died in 1809, and only around that time you can maybe argue that with Beethoven late pieces you have but it was already going on. Same thing with Impressionism. In 1860s already you start seeing Impressionism, but Debussy is 50 years later.
He didn't like that word. He
hated that word. Yeah. But again, it was already in other fields. It was always already happening for 30 or 40 years.
He thought it was old-fashioned, this sort of.
There's something about sounds, probably, or music.
Yeah, it is.
To go to your point, is that it takes more time somehow.
I was thinking about context again. I'm trying to remember. Some time recently, you played the 4th piano concerto of Beethoven with with the Geneva Orchestra, and what was that program? What else was on the program?
Trying to remember.
So I think I remember it being pretty neat, but
Yeah, there was definitely some contemporary
right, yeah.
piece, and I think we had even invited some jazz performer to do some improvisations with the orchestra. Again, when we think about piano concertos of Mozart and Beethoven, we think about them in such a, Beethoven 4th, Beethoven 5th, or Mozart 21, and so these are these monuments written by all these gods. And actually, this is why I always try to play my own cadenzas or improvise. And I'm always very jealous of all these jazz pianists who improvise in the most amazing way, because this is something we have lost. Back in the days, Beethoven in the first part of his life was apparently mostly known as this ingenious improviser.
Absolutely,
And of course, Chopin too, and Mozart too, and just later they got known as improviser. Today, this is kind of gone. So I think the element, this is something I'm happy we bring this up, because the element of improvisation in programming should come back in one way. There are so many ways to do it, and I start seeing also that in music schools, this is something that in my time, like 10 years ago, when I went to Juilliard, 12 years ago, improvising was really, you would not talk about it to your teacher. It would be really bad. And if you'd say, oh, I'm playing this Bach piece, and here there's a little place where I think I could improvise myself, you would get killed. And today you actually have more and more music schools. It's still happening, but in the last 5 years, you have more and more jazz departments, and the jazz departments have brought into the classical departments a little more improvisation. So this is definitely a movement that I'm happy to see.
I wanted to ask you about your cadenzas, because I've heard a few of them. I haven't heard your all 27 under your hands of Mozart, but the ones that I've heard and paid attention to what you're doing in the cadenza, you have this marvelous way that it sounds like Mozart, and yet it starts to shade off into more contemporary styling, not some kind of radical crazy thing. I remember the first time I ever heard a non-contemporaneous cadenza was Schnittke wrote some cadenzas for Beethoven Violin Concerto, and I was driving on the Mass Pike. I thought I was listening to Beethoven, and then suddenly I'm hearing something that sounds like some souped-up Bartók, and I almost drove off the road. I thought the aliens were landing or something. It really was a jolting thing when you're not prepared for it. But I just like the spirit in which, I don't know if all your cadenzas have been like that with Mozart, but the spirit in which you're opening it up in a very gentle way, it seemed to me.
Well, that's a point that's extremely, to me, it's very personal and very important, because cadenzas are these as you know, these little parts of a movement where the composer is basically letting the performer do something of his or her own. And the only non-written rule about these cadenzas in a concerto are that it should use a little bit of the material of the movement. And because of the 19th century, it became this tradition that you just play a written cadenza and you don't improvise, you don't try to do something of your own. And when I started giving my very first concerts, and I had done all these research, and I found out something that nobody had taught me at school, which was that when Mozart wrote down cadenzas on the paper, it was only because it was going to be played by terrible students who could not improvise themselves. But when he would premiere a piano concerto, he would never write it down, because it was so obvious that you would do something of your own. And so then you go to school, to fancy music school, and everybody tells you, you're going to improvise your cadenzas? That's terrible. going to be burned, and it's, and again, all these misconceptions, and this is why I try, and now I do it in a little less gentle way. You probably heard the first recordings. No, I'm still trying to do some kind of create some kind of bridge between maybe what some imaginary Mozart and today's world. That's the most important thing. What I cannot understand is how in 2016 somebody would just, if Mozart didn't write a cadenza, instead of saying, you know what, I have no choice, I have to do something of my own, even if it's something crazy, people will go into libraries and try to find these composers that nobody knows about that wrote cadenzas, and it's a pity.
It's another way to express. It's another way for you to relate to Mozart, to improvise using his materials to some degree.
Exactly. It's such a great opportunity when you have this possibility to play cadenzas, to just do something and somehow try to imagine. What would the composer say, I don't know, in a dream or having drinks with you, something, but it's just a great opportunity that we don't get so often as performers. And
speaking of improvising, if I can do a quick advertisement for one of David's CDs, the one called Fantasy Phantasm, talk about a dream you want to have. 8 composers from different eras brought together who are improvising as though for each other. I just think that's a fabulous conception. You give your beloved Mozart pride of place. The trajectory is amazing. It's what is called chiastic. It's symmetrical around the center. So he starts with Bach, and then he goes into a contemporary composer named Karen. Is that how you say his name? Yeah, and then you hear Brahms, and then you hear Schoenberg, and then you hear Ligeti, and then you hear Janáček, and then you're in the middle zone of Mozart, the great C minor Fantasia. They're all fantasies. So they all have a kind of improvisatory, and then you step out of this zone. I think I forgot Cage is in there, right? Cage is in there. You go to Cage, and then you go to Janáček in reverse order, and Ligeti, and Schoenberg, and Brahms, and Karen, and then Bach. And I thought it was a fabulous moment for me when you got back into the Bach. I thought it was part of the Karen piece. I thought it was another little limb of the Karen piece, and then suddenly, oh, here we are again. So Bach gets to be the alpha and omega. Mozart gets to be the secret center. Right. And I just was so crazy about this disc. And when you come out the other side of Mozart, you hear these composers differently because you've already heard them once, and now you're hearing them on the other side. I just think was a fabulous, because I thought, this is a dream I want to have. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We should have the audience ask questions.
Okay.
Idea.
And there are microphones on both sides, and you're all welcome to ask a question, not make a statement. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Andre.
Hi, good evening. I wondered, you speak about dialogue and you speak about improvisation, and I'm glad you did, because I think this is where it is. If between the two composers you found an aesthetic, a very willful aesthetic of imperfection, which is beyond just the materiality of the instruments, but a desire to codify. I don't know, it's still forming, but I was wondering if there was that element.
Well, what I would say is that usually until this program, when I would do these juxtapositions, I would have many different composers, like this album where there were all these different composers, and then this was the first program where I actually I felt it was time to be more rigorous in a way, and just to have two composers a bit of what you said, to have not just the piano playing, but also some kind of meeting point between the ideas, some kind of metaphysical ideas, so that, and the only way to do that was to just have two composers, and that's it. So in a way, that's why sometimes when I've had critics say, oh, it's a very crazy program, I say, actually, for me, it's one of the most rigorous and straight kind of programs that I've done, because it's just putting together these two composers, their worlds, and how they meet and how they converse somewhere in the universe. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your work. I was thinking back with pleasure to the last time I had heard some Scarlatti in performance, and one of the great things for me is that it always evokes, this such a rich tradition of Spanish and Latin American piano music. And I just wondered if you had to juxtapose Cage maybe with a later composer in that tradition, like a Mompo or an Albanese. Do you think, did Cage share an affinity with some of these later composers? And if you had to do it again, who would you pick as the interlocutor?
That's a tough question. I don't know exactly. Cage was a very unique character, not just because of his music, but he did so many different things. He got very much into film at some point, and he went into so many different areas. So it's very difficult to say if, for instance, I would like to know more about his affinity with folk music, and I think it's a little bit of what you mentioned, and I'm not sure how much this is something that he was, maybe I'm not sure.
I don't know, it's hard. That's a pretty good pairing. The one thing that occurs to me, he loved Asian music, and he became quite expert about it, and I could imagine that.
Yeah, I think probably if I had to guess, and the one thing about the prepared piano, and he talked about it a little bit in some of his letters and writings, is that he was extremely influenced by African music. That's really something that
Rhythmic
was
innovation, yeah.
That was really something that was very close to his heart, and a lot of the bolts and nuts and these pieces of rubber, etc. And I invite all of you to come and after the talk, if you want to go and have a look inside of the piano. I think a lot of it is simply trying to recreate sounds of tom-toms and percussion.
Make a percussion instrument.
Yeah, he really
percussion
needed
orchestra out of it.
Yeah, he needed to recreate a percussion orchestra, and that's just his way of doing it.
Especially hearing you play today, somehow I felt even more that all those clanking, steely, twanging sound, those are in the piano. Those are in the sound of the piano. In a way, his preparation just emphasized them, made them, exaggerated them. It's not like they're foreign sounds, Did you have a question?
You mentioned Cage is a strange character. Another character I think is quite strange is Moondog, and I was wondering if his either thinking or playing or compositions in some way influenced you.
Not yet.
Another question coming. I just thought of a Cage story. I don't think I told you this. The composer and critic Virgil Thomson, whom I knew for the last 10 years of his life, and as Andre mentioned, I wrote a book about him, but from 40 to 54, he was the very distinguished and colorful critic of the New York Herald Tribune. Well, Virgil was from Kansas City, Missouri, and his parents were not at all cultured, not at all musical, especially his mother, who was a very straight-talking, kind of dour Midwestern, woman, and didn't have no idea what Virgil's life was in New York. Anyway, his father had died, and she came to New York for one of her visits, and he took her to one of the first concerts of Cage's prepared piano stuff. And she was this, Midwestern lady who didn't have, she was sitting there, And she listened, and that intermission, Virgil said, well, what'd you think? And she said, it was interesting. Then she said, I wouldn't have thought of it myself.
It's a great story.
Sorry, you have a question? Yeah.
Okay, I wondered about the objectivity in performance, because there is certainly something that we aim for with these storied composers, right? So, so just 2 episodes. So one, I think, 2 summers ago, so this is an example of something that you spoke about Mozart, right? So his piano concerto, I think number 26 in D, of course, because he was also the performer in addition to the composer, he leaves out the parts for the left hand. And it was very interesting. I think it's part of the ensemble of the Knights here in New York in Central Park. There was a composer, really a recomposition by Timo Andres, like a reimagining of this piece that, well, it started off gently, as was put, and then there were shades of lots of color that you wouldn't associate with Mozart's styles, Debussy and Ravel and so on, and then it evolved from there. And it seemed like, especially judging by the audience's reaction, this was something that was probably the standout of that night, of that feature of the program. So it seemed like you can go. There's this range of how far you can go, and Andres had picked. Maybe he pushed the envelope, but he certainly didn't. He was like definitely well within the ambit or penumbra, right? And then, like, the second thing is, take something like Mahler's Sixth, right? So, Mahler Symphony Number 6, right? So here there's this debate about what did Mahler intend, the middle 2 movements. Should you go andante scherzo or slow fast or fast slow, right? And I guess most people go fast slow. Some people go slow fast. New York Philharmonic had one the other day. They have this chart of all of the performances of Mahler's Sixth, and you've got just these illustrious conductors, many of them sort of confessed Mahlerians, up and down, right? So you've got Boulez and Bernstein and Metropolis and all these people, and they all disagreed. So it seems like what they were shooting for was this quality of the music. It has to be this performance that resonates, less than Mahler would have wanted it andante scherzo. It seems that way. And then also...
Is there a question? Yeah, what's the question?
Is there a question?
What's your question?
So in other words, what's the criterion for how far you can go with objectivity? And at one point, is it just about extracting musical pleasure? Right, that's the sort of thing that you're aiming for.
What's your obligation? What is your obligation, in other words, to the...
I think it's very personal. I don't think there's any rule, and I think once every a few years or generation, there's comes somebody that will push the boundary further a little more. But I don't think there is. I wouldn't argue in any case that there's something such as a boundary, and if you cross it, because what's a boundary for me is something completely different. You know, I always say, for instance, that for classical musicians, when we see a piece and it's written in 5 or in 7 or in 13 rhythm, we're like, oh my God, it's so hard. And then you give it to folk musicians from Bulgaria or from South America who can't even read music, and they're like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. And so, you know, what's a boundary? It depends where you are in the world. It depends who you are. I think there's not one straight, simple answer.
That's something I can address, I think, because I make assessments of, you know, artists, and the Timo Andres example, that's where you're really taking a piece and kind of rewriting it a little. That's a little different. That's different than performing the Mahler Symphony. Or when David performs Mozart or Scarlatti, do I, as a critic, think there's a way, obviously there's freedom, there's personality, but is there range? Is there a certain thing that you're not supposed to violate or something? And that's a very difficult question, but I have to say, as a musician too, you know, there are structural things where performers can make a mistake. They can, in my opinion. Like if Schubert has an 8-bar phrase, and it's clearly divided into, you know, loosely divided into a group of 5 measures and 3, you've got to reject that. You can't divide it differently. You know, you can't. If that's an error. That's incorrect reading of the score. But as long as the phrasing is, you know, right, how you express it, how you get there, how much you divide it, how you shape it, that's all personal. That's all subjective. But it is possible to. But then other things become just my preference. You know, like when there's a recording of Debussy playing on the piano, accompanying Mary Garden in excerpts from a few little excerpts from Pelléas, and it's beautiful, but very rhythmic, very rhythmic. It's not all watery, and you know, I like that Debussy and Ravel played with rhythm, with rhythmic clarity. But that's more a preference. But
I think Pierre Boulez would have liked
yes,
that too.
yes, he did. Yeah. Other questions, sir? Yeah.
Thank you. I first want to say, great concert, great idea. This was your idea,
Yeah.
right? Okay. What is your next idea? I mean, well, actually, what I meant to say is, do you have another conception of how to present your next series of concerts? Because I mean, I think this is really a great idea, and it's a very fresh idea as a concert goer. But obviously, the idea of presenting music in a fresh new way is clearly on your mind. Do you have any other conceptions for future presentations?
It's a great question, and you raise a very kind of a larger point, which is this is, at the end of the day, this is a very specific program. How do you continue evolving and presenting new ideas without then becoming gimmicky and just saying, oh, it worked, this was an album that worked, and I feel good about presenting this. Now I won't do Scarlatti Cage, I'll do, I don't know, Monteverdi and Stockhausen or something. It's a real question, and I think that the answer is just keep on not trying to find ways to present music in a cool or even interesting way, but trying to find links and dialogues and ideas that you feel strongly about. And sometimes a recital or a program with an orchestra can actually look on the paper quite boring, but it's not about the program, it's about certain things that you might do as an interpreter, or some connections, or maybe improvisation, as I said, that nobody would expect because you cannot see it on the program. And once, maybe every few years, you might have a new idea. I'm in constant kind of brainstorming, trying to, but I don't force myself to think, oh, I need to have a new, unique program, because I have no doubt that if I just created a new program just because I feel it's cool or something like that, I would get caught, so to speak. You know, it's by some music critics and others. No, what I mean is that I think the crazier, so to speak, program you present, the more strange it is, the more it needs to have an immensely strong conviction behind it. It cannot just be, I have some ideas I want to put in. You need to have, again, it doesn't need to be truth, it can just be something, you know, a new proposal to the public, but you need to be convinced that it has some kind of purpose. If it's just, oh, these pieces sound great together. And so I don't have one answer to give you, but it's a process of trying to find new ways of expression.
Hello, I was just wondering, in terms of thinking about more inventive and avant-garde programming, who do you think should be responsible for taking the charge and leading this new kind of programming, like whether it's the patrons or the artists or the directors or the critics? And I was just thinking, because for you as a soloist, maybe it's easier to have more flexibility and freedom, but with larger ensembles like operas, you know, there's so many moving parts, like who should take responsibility?
It's a really great question that we're, I think all of us in the music world are thinking about all the time. Whose responsibility is it to push the boundaries and also to just speak out for certain ideas? And again, I don't think there's one answer, but for sure we're all responsible. And when I say all, I really think, of course, the artists, we're maybe number one. We have to, number one in the sense that we have the biggest responsibility to go for it. But I think that we need help from other members of the music world. That means audience. I feel we have the obligation to ask the audience for also some efforts. No, I'm not talking about money, but I'm talking about intellectual money too. But I'm talking about what we were talking about before. Sometimes you need, if you hear a piece that's complex, just wait for a second. And I think it has to do with, of course, promoters of concerts and artistic directors that instead of just thinking about selling tickets, which is, I think, still a majority of what a lot of them are thinking, to think also about their own personal responsibility. Oh, cool. Okay, maybe they will not sell 80% of their hall. Maybe they will just sell 60%. Maybe they will lose a little bit of money, but if they accepted this job, they have responsibility. And I think also for music critics as well, they have a responsibility. Of course, there's nothing objective, but there is a sense of responsibility because music critics are also part of the world. And I think professors, music professors and musicologists all have a responsibility to be part of something. I would also call it being positive. I think it's about,
absolutely.
Sometimes you hear a concert or you see a recital program that you really feel strongly about, you don't agree with, or you even hated the interpretation, but I think we have to bring more positive spirit into the music, because classical music is a business that is, I would argue, is not doing so well in many, many concert halls and festivals are not doing well today. Some opera companies are disappearing. Some opera companies that used to have to be sold out every night are not anymore. And concert tours are being canceled all over the place, not just because of the economic crisis, but also because there has been some kind of identity crisis in the classical business. So if we all work together and also try to be a little more positive about, that doesn't mean we cannot hate or feel strongly against, about something, but trying to bring some responsibility, sense of responsibility.
We were talking a little bit about this backstage. There are different ways to be a critic. I feel like David and I are on the same side. We want the same thing. We want music to thrive and be vital and healthy and experimental. And critics do the job differently, but as a former performer, I know how hard it is. I've been there, and say I didn't like this combination of composers, say it wasn't for me. Now I can either say I didn't like it, or Cage didn't care about Baroque music, or I can say, well, this really interesting pianist has this idea. He's trying to bring together these two composers. And yeah, you see what he's thinking, that you can see the connections, and it's very personal, and it's certainly different. For me, whatever, that's a different way to write a review that's positive, I happen to love it a lot, but even when I don't like something, I feel like it's my job to say, what's at stake? What's the artist trying for? What's the point? What's the larger? I'm part news reporter also. A review is part opinion column, part news story. It's not 50-50, it depends. Sometimes I have a strong opinion. Sometimes I don't have a strong opinion. Sometimes I have an opinion that I don't feel I want to hammer. I shouldn't say, I've said it in reviews. Murray Pry is a wonderful pianist, plays beautifully, nobody can say otherwise. He's such a conservative. His interest in music stops basically, maybe he's played a piece or two of Bartók, but that's it, And for me, finally, I think pianists I know who play new music, play even Mozart and Bach a little more interestingly for me. But I have nothing against him, I respect him. But whenever I review him, I can't help but say, I'm sorry, if only an artist of that power, if he picked one living composer, just one composer whom he really believed he could make that composer's reputation, to me, it's an abrogation of his responsibility. Plus, how are you interested in any art without being interested in? It's like saying, I only like old novels. I only like. I love theater, but not new theater. Or film. No, it's all ended in the 40s. That was the last good decade.
I believe he's coming here, and we can ask him.
He's a wonderful artist. Yeah. Okay.